My odyssey to Atlanta actually began when I was much younger in Mobile, Alabama. The man who lived next door to us was running for a position on the school board. And I think I must have been about 12 or 13 years old. And one night I was looking out the window, and all of a sudden all of these cars drive up, and it was the Ku Klux Klan. They all had on white sheets. They put a cross in front of the house, they set it on fire, and they began to use their rifles and shoot into the house. I was so mesmerized until I was unable to move from that window. But I kind of made up in my mind at that point in time that I am leaving. I am getting out of here. And I did. First stop was in Tuskegee University, where I went to school and received my degree. While in school, I got married to a military man. We lived in a number of cities and states. One of the places, though, that I stayed the longest was Baltimore City. My marriage crumbled. I got a divorce, and then I was living in the city, fully immersed in the environment of the city. There were a lot of people there, and yes, they had good jobs. I had what was quote unquote a good job, but they had no power, and I saw them doing absolutely nothing as far as cultural things are concerned. I tried to take my children to things because in Baltimore, you could take your children to the shows for a little bit of nothing. Well, being a single mom of two children, this was absolutely ideal for me. But when I looked around in the audience, there were no other black people there. It was all just white people. It didn't matter whether the show was an all-black cast or an all-white cast. It did not matter. Well, came to visit my sister Pat in Atlanta one time, and I was like, oh, wow. People are doing things down here, and plus they've got green grass and trees in the city. In Baltimore we have concrete, and I just was so impressed with all of that. And then you saw a whole group of black people who were involved in politics. They were involved in the arts, and they were doing things. They were making strides. I did not see that in Baltimore. So I went back to Baltimore, and 6 weeks later, I was in Atlanta. Packed up kids, car, furniture, everything, no job. Moved in with my sister Pat, but I was here.
I was a pharmacy student at Florida A&M in Tallahassee, Florida, and I had recently married, and we had to make a choice where we wanted to live. My wish was to come to Atlanta. The reason being, living for 5 years on a HBCU campus, it made me realize how important the cultural aspects of growing up were. I was pregnant. I wanted that child and subsequent children to experience the cultural environment of college life, because I noticed in Tallahassee all of the professors would bring their children to all of the cultural activities on campus. And I thought that was great. So I moved to Atlanta, and I think my children have had a great cultural exploration and involvement with the arts. And of course, being here, I missed my sisters. I encouraged them to come and visit, and they did. Kanita actually was the first person to visit me here in Atlanta.
I visited actually the same night I got married. I think we spent our honeymoon on your couch. The day that we got married, we actually got in the car, drove to Atlanta on our way to Ohio, where my husband had his job. And when I got to Akron, I'm thinking, oh, wow, I'm in the North. I'm in the big city. And I could remember back when we were children, our relatives and my parents' friends would come back to Mobile to visit. They'd always be driving big cars. And they always acted as if they were so affluent. And I was like, okay, I'm moving up north and we're going to be affluent. And I was ready to roll. And when I got to Akron, I didn't see these big cars. And I didn't see the affluence that we were led to believe because you moved to the north, you would have these great jobs. But many people worked in factories. And yes, the jobs paid pretty well, but the lifestyle wasn't all that great. And I started thinking, well, maybe some of these people rented these cars before they came to Mobile. I'm not kidding. I still believe that today, that it was a show. The other thing that I came to understand was that African Americans really didn't have very much power.
And in sharp contrast, I was here. My husband had gotten very involved in politics, and I was constantly telling them about the African American persons who were running for office, and the whole environment here of the culture and the politics was just really booming. So I was kind of gloating about that because they had gone up north, but I was here and enjoying it all.
My family came from the South, both sides of my parents' families. My father's people came from Alabama and Georgia, and my mother's people came from Alabama. They all came up during the 19-teens and 20s, but I know a lot more about my mother's family, I think because my grandparents lived a lot longer, and so we had much more conversation with them. I think he worked primarily on a farm. They had a small piece of land, and I think he also worked for other people. But he worked the land, and so that was a very precarious life, as you know, for sharecroppers. It was a way to kind of be indentured, really, to the land, because you could oftentimes borrow against the crops, and if for any reason the crops brought in less than the yield you anticipated, or if the landowner wanted to raise the price of your supplies and all of the things that you needed to live, it really kept you tied to the land. It was, for many people, it became a new kind of slavery. And so Henry Ford brought up literally railroad cars of African Americans to Detroit to not only provide the unskilled labor that he needed for the new mechanized plants, but in some ways, I think he brought African Americans up to also break this early conversation about auto unions. I mean, many of the workers were starting to talk about unionizing, and Henry Ford anticipated the impact that having a union would have in his industry. And so blacks came up in some ways to kind of head off the impending unions. That obviously happened. African Americans participated in the unions and actually rose up through the ranks. So that was another reason that I think for my grandfather and my many uncles and relatives who worked in the plants, I think they felt like they had a vested interest in this industry where they had more of a voice, a collective voice. But my grandfather essentially left Alabama to come to work in Henry Ford's auto plant. And like many African Americans, he was lured by the opportunity and the promises that Henry Ford made for what they called Northern Opportunity. And essentially, everything that I know about opportunity came from being the second and third generation who benefited from workers who were not skilled, but who made a decent living wage through working in the auto plants. We used to always tease one another because we used to say, after Jesus and Abraham Lincoln, it's Henry Ford. You know, I mean, these are very important people in my family's life.
Well, Janice, thank you for coming today. And I would like to start off with who you are and talk about your Odyssey, your Black Odyssey.
My mother was a cook. She cooked for many of the fraternities at the University of Georgia. And then my dad later on became a welder. As a child, music was just very important because Mother didn't have the chance to learn to play. So she made each of us learn to play the piano.
Now, you finished high school?
High school.
Were you valedictorian?
Yes.
Okay.
So I learned of a friend who had gone to Johnson C. Smith in North Carolina. Everybody else was talking about coming to Atlanta. And I said, oh, that's a faraway place. I'm going to Charlotte. And so I went there. It was a nice, quiet, best place for me being away from home. And then junior year, they said I could go abroad. And, of course, the lady whom I had followed there did that. She went to Beirut and studied her junior year. So I said, oh, I'm going to do that, too. But I didn't go to Beirut. I chose the Philippines because I liked the island sound. So I could still study towards the music degree. And I did that and learned to sing some of their songs in Tagalog. And that endeared me to them. And I remember a newspaper article, I still have it. Girl from Georgia sings from her heart.
Look at that.
And they were so proud. But during that summer was most enlightening. Got to travel around to 4 or 5 other Southeast Asian, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tokyo, and best of all, Jakarta. And came on back home and graduated from Johnson C. Smith with honors.
And I don't want to stop here because your Odyssey, your travels didn't stop. Tell us about some of your travels in your third career as a retiree.
Yeah, probably in the 80s. Okay. I went over to ITC, registered in the sacred music program. And through that sacred music program, I was able to study at Morehouse. I went there with those boys. The organ teacher said, you're the best student I have. I guess because the boys didn't pay as much attention. And I was their older student. And then at ITC, a professor took us to the Holy Land, was able to just see the places where Jesus walked. Then I was at the Lutheran Church, and we went to the Virgin Islands where the pastor was from, and we did a concert there. These were grand experiences, so that's why I'm a universal church member.
And your music has inspired you to go there.
Yeah.
My sister and I are the children of two academics who kind of represent that classic African American odyssey, that journey from countryside to city or from the south to the north. And with it, this kind of intergenerational striving, moving from struggling working class to struggling middle class, if not a little bit higher. My mother was born in Farmville, North Carolina, and it's really rich tobacco country. It was really her parents, particularly her father, who started the move out of the South. He and his brothers grew up either sharecropping or working their own land, but sharecropping was a really hard life for anyone, but particularly for blacks in the teens and 20s. And so my grandfather and his brothers, they went off to World War II, and when they came back, they said they were not going back to sharecropping or to working in tobacco. And they, all three of the boys, moved to New York City area and worked in capacities that gave them some kind of middle class access. And then on my father's side, that whole family is from Abbeville, South Carolina. They were sharecroppers as well. And in some ways, they might have had it a little bit harder than my mother's side of the family. That whole area is cotton country, which is a really hard crop to work. Also, Abbeville is famous for that moment for a lynching. It affected the entire black community. I mean, lynching was not just the execution of the person himself, but it was a kind of act of terror that's supposed to pacify the rest of the black community. And my father never said that was one of the catalysts that pushed his father's generation out of Abbeville, but that had to have had an effect. My father's parents' generation, both his parents and their brothers and sisters and cousins, all left Abbeville in the mid-20s and as a group moved to Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago. So it was all the classic things in terms of just the hardships of sharecropping and never being able to make enough money to feel like you were moving ahead. And then just the more general racial oppression and specifically acts of violence and terror like lynching all had an effect. And of course the pull was the possibility of a better life, greater economic opportunities, and safety. And that's what they were able to accomplish. They were always kind of struggling working class in the North. They never amassed a lot of wealth, but they certainly kind of took the next economic step that made it possible for their children, my father, to go to college. He's the first, like my mother, they were the first generation to go to college and then really become kind of solidly middle class.
I was born into a working class family on the south side of Chicago. Both parents were products of Mississippi, and so I feel as if my childhood was bilocated, as it were, with the stories and the culture and the food and the faith of Mississippi that surrounded us. My mother's family was in a small town called Battle, Mississippi, and even that name that does appear on some maps I've discovered is actually my maternal great-great-grandfather's family name. He was a landowner, sharecropper. His children then moved to Chicago after an unfortunate experience in the sharecropping economic system where they felt exploited and were not being paid adequately by the local white landowner and planter. My great-grandfather's disagreement with that prompted him to say, he said, I'm not going to stay here. He moved to Chicago, but after a few years was sick and died in Chicago, so leaving my grandmother there to raise 9 children. Our parents and grandparents, they were very anxious and nervous about what was happening to us kids in Chicago and in the big cities of America. They felt it was corrupting. They felt we were losing a sense of morality and identity, connection to the land. I remember my grandmother stood in this hot kitchen because we didn't have air conditioning. So these June, July, and August in Chicago were like, the tropics. Every month she would prepare these wonderful soul food, southern food, fried chicken and collard greens and cornbread and yams and the whole works. My favorite, of course, peach cobbler. She'd say, it's a pity that so many Northerners, and she's all Northern, black, white, and everything, had so little connection to the land. We're no longer farming, and that's not good for people. Look at you. You are eating food out of a can. And she teased my mother because my mother thought, well, this is the modern thing to have a can of string beans and to just open that. And then, of course, my dad works at Campbell's Soup. So he brings home cases of food that he's able to purchase. And so we have, pork and beans and soups and all sorts of stuff out of a can. Meanwhile, here's my grandmother, the other side of the house, saying, it's a tragedy that you all are eating out of cans. And so her act of preparing these real meals, I think, was an act of defiance and of reconnecting us.
I'm from Atlanta, and growing up in the 50s and the 60s, Atlanta is a very different city than it is today. I remember quite distinctly that Grady Hospital was the largest, tallest building in Atlanta, and Grady Hospital was segregated, and it had one set of wards for black patients and one set of wards for white patients. And if anyone goes into Grady now, they will know it's shaped like an H. And that H, it was constructed so one arm of the H was for African American patients and one arm of the H was for white patients. Grady today has 2 emergency rooms. Of course, they separated now from surgical to medical, but they were 2 emergency rooms because one was for white and one was for African Americans. Our neighborhood sitting right next to Ansley was pretty much forbidden
for blacks
to even drive through or walk through. In fact, anything on Peachtree Street beyond North Avenue was pretty much forbidden, not necessarily in writing, but it was expected that unless you had a particular assignment or a particular home you were going to do some work, you were not supposed to be going north of North Avenue.
How is it that your family were all educated, all very confident in their abilities? How could that be possible considering the environment that you were living in and, treated like second-class citizens?
In our segregated community, although they were detached from the main community, as I've been describing, and we certainly knew where the boundaries were, although there were no physical barricades, but we knew the boundaries. But we had our own intact community in which we were able to have fundamentally everything, nearly everything that we could want. We had our schools, we had great teachers who knew and loved us and supported us 100%. We had our churches, which were really the backbone of our community. We had our grocery stores, we had our life insurance companies, we had our newspapers. So we had intact communities, and we had neighborhoods in which the kids played, safely played, because everyone knew everyone and everybody felt comfortable in our community. So segregation in and of itself will never be tolerated. We understand that. But it allowed us to develop within our own community. So my parents were able to, with their diligence and planning, able to go to college and be successful and then take a job in a segregated school and therefore progress and become principals and become teachers. So that was really their ability to be successful in this segregated community.
Mm-hmm.